I came to Star Trek very late, even after becoming a computer scientist, even after my PhD in computer science. I know it's weird. So, but basically, yeah, I know it's weird. So, but basically, so when I, then I stumbled upon Mito's game, Red Shirt, which is a space social network simulation game, where you play as someone on the website Spacebook, and will need to avoid being sent on some kind of suicide mission. And I had a lot of fun, probably because, I mean, at least partly, because I actually remembered everything that the jokes refer to. It's pretty great. It's also a really, really interesting and original game idea, which is sort of typical of Mito. So Mito is another one of these people which are very hard to sort of pigeonhole, because she does a whole lot of things. So her bio on the website starts with that she's a game designer, scholar, and entrepreneur, which is pretty cool, right? So doing game studies, doing game design, and also running her own sort of game AI startup, which is pretty cool. So she basically does almost everything we're interested in here. So she's an assistant art professor here at the NYU Game Center. She runs Spirit.ai, a game development company called The Tiniest Shark, and overall does a whole lot of awesome things. So when we asked her to give a keynote here, we knew that she was going to say something awesome. We don't really know what, but hey, it seems great. And apparently it's about feelings for engineers, and I have feelings for engineers, so take it away.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Julian for the kind introduction. So I'm going to be talking about feelings for engineers. Now you can either process that with a comma after feelings or not, I guess. There's two ways to understand that. But anyway, so what I want to talk about is how a few years ago I decided to model love in a game I made called Red Shirt, which Julian mentioned. So Red Shirt was a social simulation game about trying to interact with potentially hundreds of generated NPCs on this simulated space station through this mock Facebook, but in space type interface and narrative. And in the game, you're playing as this sort of nobody space janitor type who's trying to climb up the ranks, whether that's through sort of genuine hard work and perseverance, or through various Machiavellian, am I not close enough? Or through various Machiavellian antics. So the interface and interactions try as hard as possible to map to the things that you can actually do on something like Facebook. So things like posting statuses, liking other people's statuses, maybe liking your own status, sending private messages, friend requests, updating your relationship status, and so on. And so I decided to write some code for how love might work. What happens when you send a relationship request to someone, or one NPC decides to send a relationship request to another, and how does the other one decide to respond or not? So here it is. You'll have to excuse the horribly inoptimal code. Some of it was rewritten later. But there's a few important variables at play. For example, one of the things that it looked at, and for some reason, one of the first things it checks is, are they already good friends? And the friendship has to be especially strong if they've already dated before and broken up before. Do their preferred sexualities line up? And bearing in mind, in Red Shirt, the default for creating the player character is bisexual. And then there's other things that go in there as well. There's a couple more fluffy items. So there was a romantic tendency variable that each NPC has, which defines how likely it is that they might fall in love at all. And then crucially, there's an essential piece of randomness, of course. So I want to talk about that. Well, firstly, I mean, I'd love to say that there was some deep scientific basis for having chosen to model love in this way. But really, it was entirely anecdotal, based off of both my own experiences at the time and the experiences of my friends and what I was exposed to, and I'm sure media is watching, etc. But at the time I wrote this, yeah, it was probably much more reflective of where I was in my personal life. At the time, it didn't seem to matter that it was a random roll because I kind of wanted to leave enough gaps for the player and their own conception of love. And I was less interested in all the complexity involved in our weird decision-making around things like that, right? That's not to say, though, that there aren't more theoretical, more sound theoretical sort of basis for, of varying levels of robustness for how love and romantic partnership might work and how we should model those things and select partners. From the sort of fluffy end of the spectrum, there's an exercise suggested by Susan Quillam of the School of Life, who wrote the book How to Choose a Partner, where she suggests there's this matching up of top 3 values across 3 different axes of what makes living worthwhile and achievements and personality traits. Effectively, you kind of end up with this matrix of 9 values. She doesn't quite say what you do next when you have those 9 values, but I assume you build a social simulation game where you generate a host of characters, each with a different one of those 9 values, and see what happens if you try and match them up. That's probably not what most people do. Or you can just list those 9 values on Tinder or something. Or another theory that's more mathematically grounded, which you might be familiar with, proposed by John Billingham in this old 2008 article he wrote called Kissing the Frog, A Mathematician's Guide to Dating, is that it's best to discard the first 37% of whoever you come along and date, and then pick whoever is the next best one after the first 37%. And Dr. Hannah Fry, actually, she wrote a book as well called something like The Mathematics of Love, where she suggests that obviously there's lots of problems with that theory, right? Because how do you assess whether or not the next person who comes along who's marginally better is better enough, or maybe there'll be someone else after that. So, you know, because you can't look forward, right? So anyway, there's all these different possible models. But in Red Shirt, I went with randomness. Which I think, like, since then has kind of remained with me, because I'd have loved to have gotten to a more robust theory of love and relationships and how I should have modeled them. This is what the interface for Red Shirt looked like at the time. Because it meant, I mean, not only because it would have been interesting to try and get to that, but also because there would have been more to expose to the player, right? There would have been something that I can say about this as a theory of how relationships work. So in a way, though, the lack of a particularly deep model for how the mechanics of people and feelings worked in Red Shirt didn't matter too much, because Red Shirt was ultimately a game about it wasn't really about deeply exploring one relationship. It was more about seeing people as disposable in a kind of way. Don't get me wrong, though, because I actually had lots of players write to me, write to me with various things that happened in their games about the sort of arc of their characters and relationships that came and went. There was one player who had his in-game girlfriend dump him for the boss that they both mutually worked for, who was like really lecherous and flirty. And then after he left, he left that job because he was too upset. So he got another job and got promoted up the ranks there, found someone else to settle down with. And then the original girlfriend basically came back and started spamming him with lots of messages, insisting they get back together. And so the player did, and then just sort of died, coupled but miserable. So that's Red Shirt. So one of the things I do want to point to is how, if we do, on the flip side again, if we do use randomness in these systems, it kind of gives us a get-out clause, right? So when we're obviously creating these generative systems and stories driven entirely by agents, we can obviously see the machine itself as a co-creator, someone else who's there with us doing a part of the expression beyond just the creator, us, and the player. So we can kind of rely on this sort of third participant to contribute to it equally with whatever it's decided to be the most appropriate. And so that effectively gives us this kind of useful distancing. It can be useful to us personally, by allowing us to kind of rescind ownership of a particular model that we've built in our games. So I could have been like, okay, this is a model of how love works, but no, when in practice, this isn't actually what I'm saying, it's actually the computer making these decisions. And maybe we can do that because it's too personal or too controversial or otherwise. But again, the flip side of that distancing is that it allows us to pass things off with a kind of objectivity which isn't actually there. So, oh, there we go. Just put a little artistic creator hat on the computer. So, with some of the early computer art movement, specifically, so a lot of the work of the male practitioners working in that tradition, there was this kind of attempt at self-distancing through maths. So this is Gaussian Quadratic, which was a piece by Michael Knoll, which kind of tried to foreground the relationship between maths and art. And Michael Knoll actually tried to copyright this, and you might be aware of this story. He tried to copyright this multiple times, but it was actually rejected repeatedly on the grounds that a computer had generated it, and that it was random. And so he went back and forth multiple times, and it was only when he admitted that a human had actually defined the combinations of order and randomness, and that it was actually a piece of human expression, that he was actually allowed to copyright it, and the copyright was granted. So a lot of practitioners in this way, this is just one example, specifically wanted to distance themselves from their art. And so the abstract world of math combined with the autonomous nature of the machine was what distanced them. But at the same time, wider public perception, particularly in the early days of sort of generative work, was that computers are these cold, soulless machines anyway, creating these cold and soulless artifacts. So this is a quote from Jean Hayes Beeman, who's one of the early pioneers of computer dance and choreography in the 60s, and she talked about the ways in which sort of generative work was thought of, right? So there was this uniformly dismissive message, thought of as these sort of capitalistic, soulless machines, the sort of sign of the very thing that artists were trying to emancipate themselves from. And some of her work was actually featured at the 1968 exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity, which I always love bringing up because it's such a weird and wonderful exhibition which seemed to sort of come out of nowhere for its time. And it was kind of the first ever celebration in the world of generative machine art. It was held in London at the Institute of Contemporary Art, and it was basically designed to promote the work of these pioneering artists who were using the computer to respond to, or building various machines to respond to external inputs in some way from people or the environment and react accordingly, often in unforeseen ways. You know, the word, well, the title itself, Cybernetic Serendipity, is a really nice one. And there were plenty of women whose work was displayed. It was actually curated by Jassia Reichart, which I'm not sure if this video is going to play. It's quite long, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but gives you... Is there any sound? Oh, hang on. Let me just switch my audio.
Or who have written the poetry are artists or poets or composers. In this exhibition, in the first section, we have works which are produced with a cybernetic device, with a computer. That is, computer-composed and played music, computer-generated graphics, and computer texts and poems.
There's a bit which I really like, actually. Is it coming up? So there's a wall of just sort of generative... Oh, here we go. Is this a bit... It's a word of... There's a wall of just generated words. It's not this one, there's another one, and it just kind of prints out the word poop over and over again.
What
oh, here we go, there it is.
In this particular work was to take letters which
I love
consists
the
of
slow zoom.
circles, semicircles, and straight lines. And this is why you get letters like P and L and O. And what he did was to try and find what words would make sense using these components.
Okay, so this gives you a sense of the kind of work that was being displayed there. And there were a lot of, and so the late 60s and early 70s were full of women working on generative computer art. So this is Lillian Schwartz together with one of her pieces on the top. And in a way, it's because the field of the emerging field of computer art at the time was one which no one seemed to quite own yet, right? So it was a place which felt up for grabs, as Anne Spelter said. So in those early years, social norms seemed more fluid and gender barriers remained unconstructed, even though computing would masculinize soon after. So that's kind of a side note because I was kind of talking about distancing and randomness. And randomness isn't kind of always, it's not always bad, right? So, like I said, all of that is besides the main point because as someone who is building systems for social models of things like love or people, etc., it offers an opportunity to reflect upon how that phenomenon works. But of course, there are multiple ways that we can interrogate social models. So zooming back out of all of that, so I am broadly interested in procedural character-based narratives, right? And even that, I think you can sort of conceive of having sort of being this spectrum of agent-driven stories on this end through to story-driven agents on the other end. So I just want to sort of set up some definitions and sort of what I mean by that and the way it works. So agent-driven stories are those which are based around obviously simulating the interactions of lots of agents, and it can tell us something, there we go, it can tell us something about that particular world through obviously having the player interrogate and interact with the social model that underpins those agents. And the way that we tell stories there is by really through a mechanism of noticing, right? Noticing the difference between the ways that different agents behave and the way that they're set up in opposition to each other. So which ones are different from each other? Why are those particular differences so? Like what properties do they each have? And why does that matter in the context of the particular world? So again, agent-driven stories rely on lots of agents, and the storytelling comes from noticing. So yes, you might notice the green dot. Okay, I added animations, which I totally forgot about, but there we go. So yeah, so you can see that this is not moving and the others are, so that's how you might know. On the other hand, there are what I would call story-driven agents. So these are agents which have been crafted to know a lot about a particular story space. And the way that you learn about the story space is by interacting with that particular agent through dialogue or some other set of interactions which act upon them in some way, right? So yeah, in this one, it's about kind of going deep on that particular agent and finding out about their agenda and what makes them tick. So at Spirit AI, which is the company that Julian mentioned, we're working on the sort of story-driven agents side of the spectrum. So effectively, we're sort of a tools and middleware company, and we developed two products. One is called Ally, and that's sort of more off in the area of online harassment detection and intervention. But the other one is called Character Engine, and effectively, it's an SDK and a set of tools for helping you create characters who you can have a conversation with. They'll respond dynamically. They'll keep track of what you've what you've talked about so far with them. What routes the conversation has gone down, and they will sort of effectively improvise based on the particular sort of narrative space or pool that they have. And they can draw dynamically from those. And they can also, these characters that you create can also respond with regards to how they're feeling emotionally at the time. So if as a player you've been kind of mean repeatedly, then the particular responses from the character might be kind of annoyed. They might just sort of tell you different things altogether, and so on. Maybe they'll emphasize different words. So the point is that these characters are more deeply expressive, right? So they can say things about the narrative space that they live in, which a narrative designer or a writer has specifically crafted. And they'll tell you those things through the lens of however they're feeling, and be able to understand and respond to a wide range of expressive input as well from the player. So I will try and do a live demo, which is always a bad idea. But so the particular demo that we have, this is the character in that demo, which is about interrogating a robot who has been taken into custody for some kind of crime, and is able to improvise off of both a set of examples of scripted dialogue that you've defined for it as the writer. So it has kind of an agenda that it follows, but then there's also, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, there's also a deeper, there's a knowledge model, right? So a kind of structured database of information which it can pull out and then do some text, generate some text from. So yeah, again, the point is that if you as the player have treated the character in a particular way, or you've developed a particular relationship with them over the course of a scene or over a longer game, or even if this is in some kind of pervasive game like an MMO or something, that character will effectively sort of treat you through the lens of its relationship with you. So I'll show you. Oh, so this is just a screenshot of the authoring tool that that we've built to basically craft these scenes and build these characters. I won't go too much into depth on this, but if anyone wants to ask about it afterwards, please do come up. So I'll go ahead and show the demo. I just want to show you a flavor of what the system is like. So let me just switch over. Okay, full screen. Okay, just let this get going. So there is dynamic voiceover.
I see they have sent additional investigators to collect data on Martin's murder. Hello.
So the things we output are effectively, what the thing is that the character is saying, and also their current emotional state, right? So in the top right-hand corner, in this demo, we've just output what the emotional state is, right? And it sort of ties into some light animations, but kind of that's really not the point. So don't pay too much attention to what's going on visually. You'll see that she'll shift around, but that's kind of, obviously the point is that a game developer can tie that into their own animations, etc. So she's opened with one possible sort of greeting, right? So she's got, and this will be kind of different, sort of different every time. So she's got a few different ways that she can say, effectively say hello and welcome you to the scene. So I'm going to go ahead, again, live demo. I'm just going to say hi and greet her as well.
I hope you'll have more luck than the others unraveling this murder.
We know that we're interrogating this robot. We know that there's been a murder. We don't know anything else about it. So I can go ahead and ask her, like, anything about the murder at all, or anything about what she's doing there. I'll say, who was murdered?
The victim, Martin Haster, was hit in the head with a blunt instrument once, hard enough to kill and produce a great deal of blood. It does not appear to have been a prolonged beating.
Okay, so she's got into some gruesome detail there already. So to find out more, I'm going to just say, so who was Martin? And so this information that she's giving, that she's relaying to us, actually all of this is coming out of the structured database that I mentioned. So she's got a database of facts, and she's pulling those out and forming those into into phrases, into sentences. So, for example, she says, she opens with the victim, Martin Heister. If she's mentioned Martin to us before, if we came across this later, she might have just said Martin or he, etc. So so I'm going to say who was Martin.
Martin did leading robotic research that fed into Valtruck's most profitable sales.
Okay, so, and again, this is all stuff that she's telling us from the knowledge model that's coming out of the structured database. She's still calm as well, so we can kind of start messing with her a bit now and see what happens. I'm going to ask her a completely different type of question, because so far I'm asking her about like facts and things. So I'm going to say, are you guilty?
Where the murder is concerned, the person who wielded the blunt instrument is guilty, though there might be an accessory. I'm unaware of such a person.
So we can see that she is still calm. She's getting a bit shy now because we've addressed the concept of guilt. So what I'm going to do is, and so she also will respond to sort of positional information. So I'm going to lean forward, so I'm like leaning up against her, leaning up right in her face across the desk, and I'm going to say, I'm going to ask her again, are you guilty?
Where the murder is concerned,
see she's
repeating
her answer, but now she's getting more anxious.
Is guilty, though there might be an accessory. I'm unaware of such a person.
And if we did, sometimes if you're sort of repeating something, she'll say like I said, etc. So she'll kind of contextualize it a bit. So I'm going to say, I don't believe you.
Please don't hurt me. I'll answer anything you want.
Okay, so now she's getting arrogant and really anxious. I'm going to say, actually, no, I'm going to not keep being mean to her, because I know that from past experience, I know that she, and the way that the story works, she will stop talking to you if she gets too anxious. So what I'm going to do is try and calm her down. So I'm going to lean back out, and I'm going to say, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, and so now she's happy. She's still a little bit anxious. We haven't really done much to relay the fact that we are very sorry, but so I'm going to keep talking to her about other stuff. So I know again from the story that she likes talking about her creator. So I might ask her, who created you?
Alicia is a valued researcher in behavioral AI. She created me, and she likes to upgrade me with new features.
So she's now calming down, so that's good. And again, most of this is being pulled out of the knowledge model. I'll show you an example, actually, of the way that the characters can make assessments of things like events in a timeline, like what happened before this, what happened after that. So, so I might say, what features?
My trainer, Dr. Alicia Chastain, made gradual changes to my programming that altered how I reacted to Martin, leading to a transgression in which he kissed me.
Okay, so she's talking about a particular event that happened, right? This like transgression. So I'm going to say like what happened after that, and then
after the murder, my encounter with Sergei in the loading dock happened.
Okay, I'm going to say what happened. She's getting anxious now. She's coming across the murder, so I'm going to say what happened next.
After my encounter with Sergei in the loading dock, the data loss happened.
Okay, so she's getting really anxious, right? So I'm not going to overload it too much, but that gives you a flavor of how the system works, right? So I'm going to just quit that. And this is only a very short demo. And try best make sure I close. Okay, so all right. Okay, so you can see that that very much adheres to this kind of idea of really going deep on a character, right? Trying to sort of explore their particular agenda, explore the things they know about, the things they care about. So it's all about sort of foregrounding one character and allowing us to go deep on them. And I think that's really interesting because it gets us closest to the ways in which we can possibly understand each other, right? I think I've become a lot more interested in sort of this idea of like, how do we really get at sort of models of human behavior? Really, it's by talking to each other, right? We don't have these direct feeds into each other's brains. All we have are cues from each other, verbal cues and non-verbal cues as well, language and the words we use, which are a really big part of that. So this also kind of points to the way that the two ends of this spectrum that I've defined between agent-driven stories and story-driven agents actually kind of shift the locus of who's responsible for putting that model together. Because the two types of character-based, of procedural character-based narratives affect writers and designers in different ways. With the former, with something like Redshirt, it's up to obviously the programmer or the technical designer or whoever is laying out the sort of systemic social model to define how people work. It's up to us basically as engineers to dissect and work out things like, how do people work and how do feelings work and how should we model feelings. But on the other side, so with something that like what I just showed you with story-driven agents, the shift moves towards writers and narrative designers to model the inner life of a character through language. So again, it points to how language is super important. And again, it is a spectrum. So another game that I've been working on the past couple of years, which I will finish at some point, tries to sort of be at a midpoint on that spectrum. So this is the trailer for it, but it's called Little Invasion Tales, which is a sort of quirky city building citizen management game where you're trying to manage both citizens and build buildings, etc. But it hinges on these sort of quirky emergent occurrences amongst the cast of socially simulated citizens. And the occurrences which the system deems to be the most interesting are narrated in real time through voiceover. And then some of those events are selected for kind of an end-of-game summary for the player, complete with screenshots and a sort of comic book retrospective, which they can see. So because, again, speaking of language, one of the missions that I'm trying to accomplish with Little Invasion Tales is bringing a wider, maybe more ostensibly casual audience into the fold of understanding procedural narratives and sort of, what basically happens, because all of the players' interactions with the world are converted to sort of narrated story text through voiceover. So again, it points to how procedural characters need to be expressive about their world. And that's kind of the challenge with Little Invasion Tales, because in Redshirt, it was kind of an easier problem because the world space was basically just what you could see. It was like other characters and what they were doing and so on. So it was basically procedural characters in a kind of vacuum. However, in Little Invasion Tales, there's kind of other things going on as well besides the characters, which they need to be able to comment on. The goals that I had for Little Invasion Tales was, again, this idea of having, allowing for quirky emergent occurrences between the citizens. Things that are the most interesting should be the ones that are narrated. And there should be sort of remixing of these displayed script lines. And again, the most interesting should be displayed at the end for a kind of retrospective. And again, these are all ways that the procedural characters should be expressive about their world. So the expressivity here is displayed through these means. I'm not going to get into this here because I did, together with Alan Hinchcliffe, my collaborator on this, a AI Summit talk at GDC this year about how this worked, which was basically a modified goal-oriented action planner together with a rule-based query system. The query system was also the foundation for sort of the dynamic story generation system and the thing that did the sort of the scoring and filtering and grouping of events. But yes, if you want to find out more about that and how these are sort of two separate but interdependent systems, you can have a look on the GDC Vault. So hopefully all of that underscores that it is a spectrum, and what I tried to do with Little Invasion Tales was kind of be somewhere along that spectrum, right? So again, lots of agents working sort of juxtaposed with each other, but then also hinged around sort of a story that's explicitly being told. But on that point, I'm also really interested in what can we come up with when we bring both sides of the spectrum together? What kind of procedural character-driven narratives might be possible then? So let's just sort of, almost bend the ends of the spectrum and just sort of merge them, right, into a big circle. Because then the way that the meaning making would potentially work is in both ways, right? You get kind of the best of both worlds. We get to juxtapose agents with each other, noticing the difference between them, but then you can also interrogate any given one deeper as well. Again, merging these two concepts, seeing how a particular agent works differently from another, and then going in and finding out more about them. An example that I always like to point to is imagine if something like Papers, Please was such that you could really sort of like have a conversation. What if you could talk to the characters more deeply, right? And find out about their motivations and interrogate them. I guess I've got 15 minutes or so left, so I'll start wrapping up so there's time for questions. Yeah, I think that's, actually I don't need to say that, I've said that already, so thank you.
Thanks for this excellent talk, Mita. We have time for questions, indeed. So,
Hi.
Hi.
Is this on? Yeah. How you deal with in this kind of conversational agents that you just show in the demo?
Yeah.
How you deal with unexpected questions from the user, talking about topics that actually have nothing to do, or misspelling some words or whatever? How do you deal with those?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways. I mean, so the misspellings point is a separate point which I'll come to in a second. But in terms of just input which is seemingly random, like if I ask the robot what's the price of coconuts or something, right? That's kind of an authoring point, right? So you can sort of say, okay, if the player is asking something about a topic that I don't know about, then this is the kind of here are some example responses which might be given, but you can still filter it through it's like some kind of sentiment. So is it a question to begin with, right? So you can see if it's a question, but maybe it's a question you don't know anything about, but you can still say, you could set it up so the character asks you more about it, right? Like, oh, did you mean this, for example? Or you could see, so effectively the way it works is when there is a piece of input from a player, it goes through several, I forget what the number is, but several different classifiers, right? So yeah, we have lots of information essentially about what it is you're saying. So it's kind of an authoring point, what piece of that you want to use, right? If that answers your question. Okay.
Hello. I would like to ask you if is this demo available to be tried?
Not just yet, no. So this is a demo. It's actually it's the one demo that we've been kind of showing publicly. We had it at GDC. We are working towards something that we can put on like our website, etc., or share videos of it. But it's not available publicly yet. But you can come and interact with it afterwards if you want to.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You were mentioning knowledge fact database where you store all this background information, knowledge. What kind of database is it? So is it more like a probabilistic database or some sort of logic program, or what kind of formalism do you use for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, so let me show you the authoring tool that might be, might answer a lot of these questions. So if I open this up. Okay. Okay. So yes, this is the authoring tool. So there are two sources of information. So this is the sort of knowledge, the knowledge model. So effectively, it is just a data. So there's a few different types of entities that are sort of baked into the system. So things like topics, people, events, but then you can sort of add other entity types that the character might know about or care about. So in this particular story, she knows about the concept of conclusions, she knows about the concept of places, she knows about the concept of institutions. And then you can also assign different types of fields. And again, these are completely customizable. So in here, we've said, okay, again, there are some baked in ones which are in bold, but something like the concept of goals is one that's just been added. And you can say, or even, something like age, and age is, it's a int or a number. And you can sort of say, okay, well, institutions have ages, conclusions don't have ages, etc. Right? So that's the way that works. So yeah, I don't want to sort of go into it too deep. Oh, this is the event timeline. So this is kind of where you can add information. Add specific events like we asked about. So that's where you'd say, okay, what happened before this? What happened after that? How long after this did this happen, etc.
You're using this authoring tool to build this knowledge base. I'm wondering if we could write an algorithm and like process some events, some news from an event. I mean, for instance, I've been to the 9/11 memorial.
Yeah.
If we fed the news and information into this timeline and everything, so we could ask questions about that.
Yeah, we've actually done some prototyping of that with just an XML feed of sports scores from like
and the bot behaved like.
And you can just ask questions about about that particular event that it now knows about. So there was a different character. It wasn't this bot.
But the algorithm was the same.
So it's basically just storing it in taking in an XML feed, storing it in the format of the knowledge model, which is just XML. So yeah.
Thanks.
Hi. What is the kind of information you have on types, the effect of types of events, emotional effect of types of events? Say things in the story that can make you sad, angry, tired, fed up, and so forth.
How do you mean?
How do you author this, and how do you determine what are the effects on the character that certain types of events in the story have had?
Oh, I see. Okay. So there's a few ways that can work. So again, this is all made easy in the authoring tool. So for example, so you can sort of say, okay, if the player's sort of input context is such that they're being angry, right? They've said something which is kind of mean or whatever, then the response, the sort of performance that comes back from the character will be to set their sort of emotional state to this thing, for example, right? So there's a few ways that this can work. I'm trying to find a good example of this. And again, so these, well, just to sort of give you some context, so this is, these are just sort of examples of sort of input context from the player. So if the player says something like, who accused you? So this is a context which is, okay, they've said this with this, it's a question that we recognized, it's about guilt, it's about the robot's identity, the performance that they'll return is, they'll say things like that with all these different variants. And then also they, we can say that this will happen when they have this particular trait active, etc. When they're, when they're angry, etc. And these are all emotions that I don't know if right now you can define them, but eventually you'll be able to sort of add custom emotional states as well. So, any other questions?
So I thought of, okay,
yeah.
we still do have time. So basically, I mean, I know that this is, and sorry, I've seen the system before. I know that part of the point of this is to break free from the traditional sort of mode of interaction in adventure games, role-playing games,
Yes.
where you essentially
Yep.
have dialogue trees and you can explore them. And basically, if you play, Zelda or Skyrim or whatever, if you want to sort of get further in the story, the thing to do is to talk to all the people and ask all the questions and say all the things, and eventually you'll have exhaustively explored the conversation space, and that will progress you in the story. And many of us maybe do that. That's how we play things, such as Mass Effect or whatever. I'm not sure I'm proud I actually got the achievement completionist in Mass Effect 2. This is sort of wanting to change that model completely and have a different type of interaction, which I think is fantastic. But how do you then control the difficulty of progressing in the game? Because, I mean, what you're showing here is a way of doing exploration. But what about progression? How can you sort of how can you make sure that an average player such as me would eventually sort of progress in the game?
I mean, that really depends on how you've incorporated the character into the scene, right? So it could be a scene about, okay, you have to get this character, in order to progress, you have to just get this character angry. It doesn't matter how you do it. You just have to get them angry, right? So, and then once you've done that, once that trait has been activated in the character, then you can progress. Yeah. For example.
So then you basically can. So then you're still doing sort of exploration, but in another space, you're exploring the feeling space.
Yeah, it's true. Exploring the feeling space.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. It just strikes me as like there's a lot of interesting challenges in trying to automatically set and judge this difficulty. I mean, a lot of the work on sort of level generation goes on, and game generation is trying to address the difficulty problem and the challenge problem by doing automatic playtesting and so on. Could you see this being combined with automatic playtesting, for example?
Yeah, so, well, one of the things that we are working on, and again, all credit to, so Emily Short is actually the product manager for this particular side of what we're doing, and, you all know her work, she's amazing. One of the things that is coming is an addition to the sort of authoring tool where we sort of have an easier way to read in sort of like a whole bunch of player logs and sort of add in any sort of content that we've sort of missed, or here are particular things that players tend to be asking about the most. We should probably write, more content for this piece, and just lots of handy visualizations for narrative designers to be able to take just player data and and enhance the character.
Cool. And when you say authoring, so let me just continue by asking the question from the other Julian, the one that isn't here to help game designers, but to replace them. Right. So could you get past the authoring? Could you automate that part as well, and automatically create these sort of? I
mean, I'm gonna be careful with what I say because
you're in a live stream.
because well, I mean, one of the things that we're explicitly underscoring all the time when we go in to talk to studios is this is not about replacing you, right? This is about helping you be more creative and like do more, and generate more types of variation in things that characters can do and say and behave from the things you've written, right? So that's my diplomatic answer.
It's great.
The other thing I wanted to add, so obviously I'm talking about my sort of interest in so why conversation is like kind of an interesting mode of interaction and finding out and exploring social models. There are a lot of people who are interested in systems like this, and people that we're working with who are using this in kind of VR contexts, right? So the input being speech to text, and then doing the rest of the kind of processing you've seen here. And even, we had an earlier version of this, which was designed for like pre-GDC this was, which was set up in Vive, so you could actually like walk around the robot kind of in room scale, and she would respond to kind of where you're standing and comment on if you're sort of facing away from her, or like if you're looking at a wall while you're talking to her, etc. So currently we're sort of improving the sort of speech to text capability, so we're not sort of running that demo right now, but and there's a lot of people sort of, that we're working with who are interested in that kind of VR application. But I think, rather than it being about believability per se, because we were talking about this on the panel yesterday, right? Is the ultimate goal these sort of really naturalistic characters who kind of reach towards, like the idea of virtual humans? I think that is interesting, but I think that just the idea of conversation alone is just a really interesting mode of interaction. But then believability is important as well. So my doctoral work was looking at how sort of things like VR affect believability, right? Affect the way that we process what we're doing to characters and how we're interacting with them. So, yeah.
Right. And with that, I think we've reached coffee.
Okay.
So let's thank Mito again. Excellent speech.
Thank you.
Next session starts at 11, General Video Game AI.
Hi.
We're going to have a lot of time to entertain you in the next couple of weeks.
Oh, cool.
But first question for now.
Yes.
Have you?
I know, yeah.